Welcome everyone, and thank you for listening in to Being With, a podcast series produced by the Biennale of Sydney as part of our 23rd edition rīvus. Before we begin, I would like to take time to acknowledge the many different countries we connect from today. I come to you from Gadigal country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands, waters and skies, the Gadigal clan of the saltwater people of Sydney, and elders past, present and emerging. I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends here with us today. I would like to take this opportunity to highlight the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's spirit, imagination, and rich history of storytelling and artistic practice that is an ongoing inspiration to me personally and our team at the Biennale of Sydney. My name is Leah Smith, and I'm the Curator of Programs and Learning at the Biennale of Sydney. I'm delighted to be here today with Dharug woman and Biennale participant, Leanne Tobin. Leanne is a multidisciplinary artist of Irish, English and Aboriginal heritage, descending from the Buruberong and Wumali clans of the Dharug, the traditional Aboriginal people of the Greater Sydney region. Leanne works collaboratively with community groups, local schools and institutions, using her art to tell local stories and to evoke an environmental conscience and respect towards the land and its original people. Her art practice seeks to encourage an open and honest dialogue about the past and to nurture respect and care for country, paying homage to our old people and their legacy. Before we delve into conversation with Leanne, I'll share a curatorial note on Being With. Being With features local and international voices from across our exhibition program. It aims to shed light on the rich and diverse relationships we hold with nature, science and technology through facilitating a deep dive into rich and ongoing creative and conceptual practices that span art, design, environmentalism and activism. Through Being With, we aim to demystify interspecies communication and connection through moving between micro and macro environments. Ancestral and futuristic knowledge systems and cultural practices will be discussed as tools for understanding how these relationships are and furthermore can be nurtured. Being With is a beautiful reminder that amidst a global pandemic, we are never truly alone. My conversation with Leanne today will be grounded in Being With Eels. The talk will ebb and flow and reference eels' grand migratory journeys, acknowledge their resilient and transformational nature, and highlight the cultural significance of this intriguing marine animal that is deeply significant for the Dharug people and Aboriginal Australians more broadly. Now it's my great pleasure to hand you over to Leanne. So Leanne, please share your name and where you connect to us from.
Hi, Warramie Midiga. Welcome friends. Hi friends. My name's Leanne Tobin and I'm a Dharug community artist, descended from the Buruberong and the Wumali people. Buru is belonging to kangaroo. Well, Buru is kangaroo, Buruberong belonging to, so I'm from the kangaroo people. And Wumali is the Prospect Hill people. So, yeah, Blacktown, Parramatta, that area. I'm connected up with this project. I'm really excited about being involved. I think it's the first time they've had a Dharug artist solo working in the Biennale, participating. And I'm nervous and excited at the same time. But, I look forward to being able to tell our truths. And, with the theme this year of NAIDOC being healing country, it's just another step forward for me, I see, for our people.
Thank you, Leanne. That's beautiful. We had a chat earlier and there's many stories that you've been sharing with me, but maybe let's jump into just, an invitation for you to just share a story with us and our listeners that is, significant and important to you. And then we can kind of unpack that together.
I guess, like I was mentioning earlier about my particular journey, everyone's journey, and this goes for all Aboriginal people, we're all quite unique in our journey, Dharug people in particular, because we're first impacted. I guess that's probably an important starting point because my family made the decision, my grandmother made the decision to keep silent about our Aboriginality because of our pale skin. She was able to pass her kids off as white, despite being in the middle of the heart of Parramatta, surrounded by relatives who acknowledged their Aboriginality. It was that secretive, that hidden, and the stigma attached to being Aboriginal is so high, it could cause all sorts of situations. Have your children removed, have the house frequented by government officials and police and all the rest. So consequently, that truth of our heritage was kept away for a long time. And I only came into it when my cousin decided to research my mother's family history. We knew all about my dad's Irish ancestry, but mum's was sort of this secret. We didn't really know anything about it except that she'd had a hard time. We all knew that she had a hard life. So it was a real shock when we found out. And I like to tell the truth about it because I think people need to understand it's definitely a result of colonisation that this situation's occurred, especially when you consider Sydney's a small place and many families had to survive in whichever way they could. And my grandmother made that decision, which, I see it as her way of protecting her 6 children. And she'd separated and divorced her drunken Irish husband and had to survive. And this was her way of doing it. And, Mum found out later on in life. She was in her late 50s when she found out about her heritage, and my grandmother had passed without ever telling any of them. And yet all her relatives, our cousins, and since we've come out and acknowledged our Aboriginality, our Dharugness, for lack of a better word, I've realised how extended our family is around here. And so I've got cousins and family members that we didn't even know about. And Mum's now making sense of things that happened to her as a child. People she knew, but she didn't know they were relatives. People called a cousin, her mother would say, "Oh, they call everyone in the street cuz." It was such a weird awakening for my mum, I can imagine. It's taken a long time for her to get used to it, but there's the family, we've just embraced it and run with it. And this is Australian history. This is, shared history because it's Sydney. We're the first contact of people coming together and having to survive and make it out of that time. And, we're a product of that. And, as I was saying to you earlier, Leah, that I think it's important that we acknowledge those gaps and why they happened, because that explains the situation at the time. Like other family members that grew up around, and I've got a lot of Dharug family now, they always knew about their Aboriginality. They grew up with it, they embraced it, they lived it. My grandmother, for whatever reasons, decided to hide it, and everyone around her kept that secret, which is, pretty amazing. It tells you about that time, the climate at that time, how it must have been for her to be able to maintain that. So,
yeah, keeping that, concealed. The word that you used earlier was to protect.
Absolutely. Yeah, because your children be taken away.
Yeah, that's right. It's such a bold move because I loved again tapping back into some of the things that we're talking about before, like that you were kind of mentioning that you always had this real connection to place and an affinity with the environment and these kind of understanding that humans are not the only ones who are sort of part of this landscape, but how that that separation stunts your ability to understand how you're connecting with community, how you're connecting with place, but also recognising and understanding that these choices are being made.
And the weird part is, the irony of it is, my father was the one who gave me my love of the country, of the bush. And as a child, he would take me out open air painting. He was a painter back then, before life took over. And I was lucky enough to have that experience with him. But his love of the bush and everything around him, I think it's the Irishness in him, the Irish in him can't help but embrace the landscape. That nurtured that desire to know more. He was always asking questions or getting us to answer questions, or why do you think this rock looks like this, or what about this? And
Developing
critical conscious mind of the space and that we occupy in the world we live in. So, all of that was very important.
And what about, I think it's such an interesting story that you're sharing with us, and also, your it's important, as you also kind of mentioned, to kind of claim that story and to present it in a really honest and authentic way, and to not try and pretend, but to also be aware that that journey has taken place for very prominent reasons, thus colonisation and fear, right? But what do you think this journey has sort of, what kind of effect has it had on your mother, for example, or, your siblings who are also kind of on this journey with you?
Oh, it was like our whole world got turned upside down. It was the weirdest thing, because Mum and Dad were both in the Air Force. That's how they met. Mum escaped her life in Parramatta. She did amazing to get out of there with very little education too. She managed to get herself through and out into the world, and met my father, and she followed him from pillar to post, went all around Australia, and then when he left the Air Force, we were still wandering here and there, but that profound effect. When I found out about my Aboriginality, I was actually working as an Aboriginal resource teacher, weirdly, in the middle of Kakadu National Park. It's my first teaching job, and they'd positioned me in this place, and immediately, it was such a foreign place for me to be, but I connected straight up with the local people there, and they gave me a skin name. I was welcomed into their families. It was just quite amazing as a teacher. And I remember an old woman just touching me when we were having reading circles. She just touched my arm saying, "You're not all white." And I had no idea. It was only a month after that I got the phone call to say, my cousin had discovered this amazing ancestry. So it shocked me. I kept very quiet about it. I couldn't tell, I felt, how can I say I'm Aboriginal when I'm surrounded by, I was steeped in like traditional life up there, and people very much connected to country. When you meet Aboriginal people, you have to be connected in somehow. So that was very obvious to me. And I was working in a class situation where I had kids who were miners' kids, mining executives' kids, park ranger kids, scientists' kids, and then workers' kids, and Aboriginal kids from the bush, Aboriginal kids from urban environments. And it was like this big melting pot just in this one room where, there was lots of racism and all sorts of things that from the outside had been brought into the class. And we had to work through that. I had Aboriginal kids who were learning how to read and write for the first time, how to read and write English, but they knew 3 or 4 other languages. Yeah. And so I used to explain this to the other kids who was, they can't even read and write. So it was amazing learning, environment for all of us. Yeah. The English lessons for the Aboriginal kids were, let's go for a bushwalk. And we used to do that once a week. We'd go around the perimeter of the school, the days when you could just get a note from your parents. And we'd go, and we'd go out bush. And the kids, the local kids would be, that was their English lesson. They were teaching us all about their environment. Yeah. We would see, because we did it every week, we saw the changes in the weather, and we saw the indicator plants, the animals. We observed all the changes that were coming through. And for all the other non-Indigenous kids, it was like the biggest learning that they've ever had in their lives. I've met some of those kids now as adults, and they often remember that time as being an awakening, because you suddenly realise just how much those people up there knew of their country. And I'm so blessed. I really feel like I was led there. I was meant to be there. That was my school, my training ground. And then I stayed up there for a long time. My son was born up in Darwin. And then a friend of mine who was doing cross-cultural awareness with government bodies and with local Aboriginal communities, he said to me, have you ever thought about Sydney, going back down there? I said, no, I couldn't wait to get out of Western Sydney. And he said, they need you down there. I said, what? I had no comprehension of what I was getting myself into. My father passed away, and then I got very sick, and I had to come down. And it was when I was dragged screaming from paradise with my son in tow, and we stayed with my mum, and it was like a door opened and it just took off from there. My art became meaningful because I had stories to tell. I had real stories. It wasn't just pretty pictures. It was stories that had powerful, connotations behind them, because I was learning. As I was learning, I was sharing.
Yeah.
So, my way of learning, absolutely, my way of learning was through art.
Really, I love that we'll talk about it more like as we move on, but how your art practice is such an interesting way to tell that story, but also ground your learning and kind of solidify
reinforce
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about the place that you're from, Parramatta. So you mentioned that that's more strongly aligned with your mother.
Yes, that's Mum's country. When I say Mum's country, that's where she was born.
Mm-hmm.
She was born in a terrace house that where the Albion pub now, on the banks of the river there. That's where she was born. And Mum was born in 1933, and she didn't realise this, but I said to her, she said, a lot of our neighbours were born in this terrace house, it was a particular place. And it turned out it was a midwife. And at that time, because of the White Australia policy, Aboriginal women weren't allowed to have their babies in the hospitals. Right. So, when I told Mum that was only recently I told Mum, she was shocked because it was the realisation that's why that happened.
Right.
And that's how it was back then. And people have very quickly forgotten those things. But, this is the thing. And
that's
I guess
some very recent history.
Absolutely. And Mum's, because Mum grew up not knowing about her Aboriginality, it's interesting because she's got observations that now she can make sense of. Yeah. But at the time, it was just how life was. Yeah. So things like her brothers would go out and they'd catch eels. They'd go fishing and swimming down Parramatta, or Burramatta as it's known, and they'd catch eels. Her brothers would make canoes out of corrugated iron and tar from the road.
Really?
Wow. I just love that, it's taken an old skill and making it, renovating and it's an innovative way of putting it together in a more contemporary medium, and they would go out and they would fish for eels. They'd bring them back and her mother would cook them up.
Wow.
And so it's like this continuation. And, I mean, we've had all sorts of dramas in the past with, native title and not being granted because we didn't have connections to country. And I just think how ironic and weird is that, because, we weren't allowed to have connections. We were taken off country. We were pushed off country, dispossessed. But here is this harking back to an old time in a contemporary medium. So I love that. And Mum didn't really know that was actually, it's a historical thing that your family have been doing that for generations.
Yeah, and it's like that compulsion to keep doing with whatever means you have available.
Yeah, and she knew about the duan. Her mother would scream. She'd heard this bird down the back fence, the duan's here, and she knew something bad was going to happen because that's our death bird.
Right.
And if you hear that, and every Dharug person knows about this bird, if you hear that bird, then, within a few days someone's going to pass away. And sure enough, her Uncle Billy passed away, Nan's brother. Yeah, so those things came into Mum's life, but she wasn't aware of their Aboriginal origin. So, it's fascinating.
So let's jump into the eel, because today's, we're talking about being with, and the focus is really on the eel story for us here today. So when did the eel story sort of meander into your practice?
How weird, isn't it? Hey, I used to swim in the river, and I've had friends step on eels and, I've seen them. I've never thought too much about them. It's not my preferred eating, even though they're supposed to be incredibly nutritious and full of all the good stuff. But I grew up with them around me as a teenager. I'd swim with them, no problem. But I guess in my art, it came with really trying to understand, I was looking at creation stories from around the place. And then I got on to, I learned about Gurungurra, they're our nearest neighbours. And then we found out there were all sorts of signs here and there along the river. There's engravings and paintings that we're only now just starting to understand, even only just, I think it was last year that Grace Karskens, who's done the
river story, the people of the river. In her finding, and I'd actually seen some of that list, it was broken up in pieces, but she was describing all these place names along the river that she'd found from this recording that had been made out at Ebenezer in the early 1800s.
So, I mean, you mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I forget the actual name, the bird?
Oh, the Duwang.
Duwang
bird,
So,
yeah.
I mean, the Duwang has this kind of relationship with death. And I'm curious, for the Dharug community, does the presence of the eel sort of suggest something in the landscape when you encounter it, or is it sort of quite abundant?
It's a sign of clean water.
Okay.
It's an indicator of a good, healthy environment.
Yeah.
So the eels, when you start, I started doing it because I knew they were a food source. Then I found out there was creation stories around the eel. Because the creation story for the southeast coast, a lot of the stories, and we met people from Victoria who had a similar story, where the eel was like a ancestral creative figure, the Garangach, the Gumigara call him, Garangach, and he was chased by meerkat, which is a native pole hunter, really very, very esteemed hunter, apparently. This is how the story goes. I'm not much of a storyteller, but I'll give you the short version.
You're a beautiful storyteller.
And he chased him and all through the landscape. So we've got the Jenolan Caves, we've got all the holes, Wallandilly, all that area, all the rivers down there, all the way through out to the sea. And then when we get to the sea, there's another creation story for all the bays between the shark and the stingray, I think it was. My brother will know that story. But the eel was a very, very powerful creative figure, sort of equivalent to our rainbow serpent.
Yeah.
Almost, and they discuss it as a rainbow. We've got stories of rainbow names along the river. Absolutely. And the eel is just one of those ones that it's an ancient creature, but it's also relevant today because it's telling of our rivers.
Yeah.
It moves between the saltwater and the freshwater. Its journey is it's unbelievable. It travels all the way up to the Coral Sea when it reaches maturity in the Billabongs and the rivers around the southeast coast.
Yeah, so it's actually, I wanted to chat about that.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much.
Yeah, because I remember, I was chatting with Hannah Donnelly, the First Nations producer at ICE, Information Cultural Exchange in Parramatta, also a member of the curatorium for the 23rd Biennale of Sydney. But when we were chatting about your work, she gave me like this very brief insight into the incredible migratory path or patterns of the eel. So maybe we can jump into that, talking a little bit about where they come from, where they go. I didn't know that they travelled between fresh and salt water.
Yeah, they even go across land, which is pretty amazing when it's wet.
Wow.
They will move from billabong to billabong. So I can't imagine coming across a giant eel in the middle of the night.
That's incredible.
But that's, and when you've got your heavy rains, the early autumn rains, when we get heavy rains, that's when they're coming down from the rivers, the ones that have reached maturity, the male and the female. The female's full of eggs, the male's ready to go, and they head down the creeks and see Parramatta as one of these places where they gather. And it was renowned as a gathering place. It was a corroborate place, Parramatta. Burramatta translates as a place where the eels are, or water place where the eels lie down. So, it's a place where all those large eels at that time, that migratory time, would sit there and wait for a high tide because it's an estuary river. So you've got salt and fresh water. So you wait for a high tide, full moon, and the eels are ready to go, and they head out to sea with the rain washing them out of the rivers into the ocean. And they go through incredible transformation. So they go from being your average eel you see in a river to suddenly it's their eyes enlarge, their anus closes, and they are sleek and fat, absolutely, with layers of fat laid down for their huge ocean journey. They do not feed from the time they enter the ocean all the way up to the Coral Sea.
Where's the Coral Sea?
Coral Sea's up in New Caledonia area.
Wow, okay.
And, You know, it's funny because I only ever went on one cruise, and I realised when I was going on the cruise, I went to Vanuatu. I was in the middle of the ocean. I think, oh my God, I'm on the migratory path of the eel, and I went to where they spawn.
Wow.
And apparently they spawn. They're really mysterious animals. People don't know a lot about them still. They've apparently got satellites on them and all sorts of things these days. And I think, oh, well, it'd be good to find out. But they actually, they come out of the rivers, they go all the way up there, and the only reason we know that that's their place where they give birth is because that's where they've found the smallest eels.
Right.
The smallest little glass eels.
Right. So kind of a baby tracking.
Yeah. The largest eels and the
Surveillance.
smallest eels are found there.
Beautiful.
And they die there. They apparently mate at a depth of 300 metres, so really deep. I can't imagine this. This is what's going on out there.
Yeah.
And then the little,
place.
it is, eh? And then all these little eels make their way, millions and millions of little glass eels, and they're transparent. And I've represented that in my sculptural piece that I'm looking at doing, the installation of these little eels coming back. They find their way along. They follow the currents. The currents sweep them along the coast. Then they move into the rivers back to their place of origin. So, you know, and then as soon as they hit the river, the fresh water, they change to the colour of the river.
Wow.
So it's just
like
this,
sort of
because of what they're eating
Yeah.
as well. All the microorganisms and things that they're
Right.
eating. The river diet then colours them up so they become the colour of the river.
Become one. Wow.
Mm.
It's a one with their environment.
Yeah.
That's wild.
It is. And it's so important. This is the other thing too. We've got these, you know, dams being, they want more dams, walls to be raised and more, you know, mismanagement of water, I call it. They call it management of water. I think it's mismanagement. They've totally stuffed up our river, that Dharug there, with over mining, sand and the gravel from that was their natural filtration systems. They've destroyed that. I swam in the rivers when they used to dredge the sand from the riverbeds. That's illegal now, you know, but this is Whitefellow Way as opposed to Blackfellow Way.
Yes.
Whitefellow Way, better fix that now. Blackfellow Way is no, don't touch it, leave it, conserve it for those who are before us.
Yes.
Or after us, following after us. So, you know, it's such a juxtaposition of positions to be in. It's so separate.
Yes.
And
now,
now,
also do the damage and then repair.
I know, it's frustrating.
I can imagine. And also just, that sort of destabilisation of these kind of ecosystems, the environments.
And yet the eels still persist. Like they're moving through Centennial Park.
Yeah.
They're moving up over dam walls.
Yeah.
You know, my
It's
goodness.
wild.
And that's the other thing too. I just think, wow, that's resilience. And it's sort of representational of our people.
Yeah.
That's how I see it. It's like, you know, we're still here. Doesn't matter what barriers you put up. Doesn't matter how high you make us climb. Doesn't matter how wiped out our environment is. We're still here.
We're waiting for the rain and we're climbing the wall.
Wait for the rain. Bring on the rain.
That's wonderful. You spoke a little bit just now about your project for the Biennale, and I'd love to learn more about that. So the eel is a significant part of this project. And you mentioned that you're kind of playing with this translucent, glassy type.
Oh, my gosh. I hope it pulls off. I hope I can pull it off.
You will.
I came across it because I did another sculptural piece for Blacktown Hospital, but that was a suspended piece, which is, you know, terrifying. These glass eels hanging from the ceiling in the foyer. And it was called The Call of Home. And that was my first encounter. I'm working with Ben Eddles and his wife, Kathy. He's a master glass blower, just unbelievable. And watching him make those eels down in Canberra, he was like catching the eel. He'd go, this lump in glass would go in, and it'd be pulled and moved and flipped, and it was just fascinating to watch. It was, absolutely. And these eels come out and they're like living things. And then I remember we had to present them to the architectural designer. He was working with me. And went to Ben's studio, Ben and Kathy's studio, and he had them, brought them all out, unwrapped them out of the bubble wrap and put them on this white foam core out in the backyard, and the sun came through and so beautiful. You look at the reflection, and the reflection is like the river. Because that molten glass is pulled and stretched and it's weaving through it. It's just like the river. And that captured me straight away. I thought, oh, my God. I didn't get to do that with a sculptural hanging piece, But I'm hoping to do that with this installation because that it's reflecting the river, but it's also harking back to a creation story, an old story from that time. And, it's glass is still a natural transformed element, but it's still it's from a natural source. So, and it's sand. There's so many beautiful parallels. I just love it.
That, like, it has a liquidity,
but
also like a sense of like that solid structure,
solid but fragile, too. So there's all this.
And I guess the way that it holds light and reflects light. Yeah.
It's like it's sitting right next to that story of the environment. It's to me, it's like that. This is a symbol of the fragility and also the strength and tenacity and resilience of the environment too, despite what's happened. And it fits in with our Dharug story too.
So do you imagine that these eels will be sort of hung on the wall, or will they be suspended?
Yeah, we're going through all the installation options. I'm playing around. It was going to be suspended. Everyone wanted to do that. And then I thought they just might get lost in that big space. So now I'm looking at possibly having it reflected on plinths, like made of hebel, with sand ripples through it or something. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking now.
More environmental, like creating a little
and also
ecosystem.
Like ease of moving if they want to move it somewhere else, and if we want to, exhibit it elsewhere.
Sure.
You want to be, and plus the environment because it's open near the sea.
Yeah.
I can't imagine having suspended glass eels passing the safety test. So, I don't know. Anyway, we're still working through these little logistics.
I love that you talk about this creation story. It's so interesting because it's something that I've noticed in my conversations with artists as part of the Biennale. Many, many artists come back to some type of watery creation story. Mata Aho, for example, we're talking about a Maori story of the sea woman, and how
they've got connections with the eels over there too. It's the same story.
It's really nice to kind of see how strong that is, and it just and guiding the practice in not a really overtly obvious way, but just being such an important part of grounding what you're doing, why you're doing it, and kind of.
And especially, like, it's funny when you fly over Sydney and you start to see how all the river systems are connected up. We've got one river. And this is where I love the use of Aboriginal names because it tells of place. Whereas, Whitefella name, whether it be, Hawkesbury Nepean River, it's got two names because they discovered two parts and it was actually the same river, but we call it Hawkesbury Nepean because there was two people who found it. We traditionally called it the Dharug, or Durban, depends on how you pronounce it. It's up to various people, but when you see that, and then we've got another creek called South Creek. Traditional name is Waianamata. Now, Waianamata is Mother Creek, so it's talking about the Mother Creek. And when you look at an aerial map, all the little creeks around feed into the Mother Creek, who then empties into the Dharug. So, and there's eel shapes all the way through it. You can see, and the story goes that Garangati, as he was being chased, pushed all the dirt and forged the rivers and the creeks, and the dirt piled up and they made the mountains, and then you got the holes down underneath where you burrowed down underneath the mud, and they're your caves. So, it's a beautiful big story.
Yeah.
We're still learning lots about it,
That's incredible. Yeah, language, again, is just a whole nother conversation.
Yeah,
but it is
absolutely.
very
It's so powerful, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That traditional Aboriginal names, I'm big for restoring those names.
Yes.
You need to have those names because they describe that geological place.
Yeah, and it's again about giving that giving that ownership back. Right?
Absolutely.
Not eliminate, because
it's a funny thing because you've got and we've got a funny little white-black sort of crossover where you've got words now, Aboriginal people's names being like Bennelong's Point or Pemmoy, the suburb. That was so not the Aboriginal way to name places after people. And it really bugs me and annoys me when I see that. I know they're trying to honour those people, but it's such a
Western way.
It's such a Western way to do it. Oh, we're going to name it after this person. Whereas Aboriginal way was to name it after the description of the place. So when you're reading a name, like sometimes I'll see something, it says it translates as Frog Creek. Must have been a lot of frogs in that creek. Like it tells you about the place.
Yeah.
Parramatta, place of the eels.
Yeah.
You know, so it's the Parramatta was a place where people came from tribes, different tribes all around, down south coast, up north, all would come down at that time in the autumn time, the heavy rains, to just before the heavy rain would come and eat those eels, share those eels, get married, you know, have discussion, whatever. Big time.
That's such an interesting observation. And of course, like that would be so front and centre to you. Like I hadn't even thought of it, but you're so right. Like, you know, Hume Hovel, whatever, like up exploring the Blue Mountains.
Yeah,
and now,
so we're going to name a highway now.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it was actually on an old ancient Aboriginal track, but hey, let's not talk about that.
Yeah.
It's just
and then just
frustrating.
giving it back to two people that, you know.
I know.
Oh, wow.
I know, it's weird.
Interesting. All right, so final question. I mean, this is more just about our sort of takeaways from this. So what do you hope your listeners will take away from this podcast, and furthermore, perhaps audiences more broadly who experience your project for the Biennale of Sydney, you know, physically?
Well, firstly, I guess it's highlighting an old ancient story that's been going on forever. You know, these songlines are running across this land. They haven't gone away. They're still here. Some of them have been hidden and forgotten, but they've not gone away. It's just that our memory has been broken through colonisation, dispossession. We were taken off country. We were told not to speak our language. And, you know, these things have impacted on these ancient stories. But what I'm hoping is my art piece will help to revitalise and bring back those stories, make people have a little think about that. Maybe they haven't even thought about an eel, let alone the migratory path of an eel, let alone the creation stories of the eel, and, you know, also the revitalisation of the Dharug people as well. You know, we've been hidden away, walked over, suppressed, kept quiet, and not anymore. We've got permission now. We can stand up and speak, and those who survive, God knows how, we're still here, and we've got big stories to tell. You know, First Contact Point, Sydney, you know, it's important to hear that story where those two lines collided.
Absolutely.
And, you know, the outcome of that and the survival despite everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Leanne. It was such a pleasure to chat with you. Is there anything, sort of any final...
The last thing I meant to mention too, I meant to mention with the eels because it was important. You know how we talked about the eel coming into the river. As it comes into that environment, it becomes that environment. And I like to think of that as an analogy to the Dharug as well. You know, as we've had to survive, we've had to adopt and change and take on new ways, and learn new ways as well. And you know, it's a foot in both camps really that we have, and it's an important position. I used to shun away and be a bit frightened of it, but now I recognise that it's actually an important role to have a foot in both camps, to be able to work with cross-cultural consultants as such.
And I also think too, to kind of, you know, look, and I don't want this to sound like I'm talking for you or the Aboriginal community at all, but I think it's important to have, for publics, to not have this idea of what Aboriginality looks like, you know, to really diversify what that looks like, and how people, like you said, are, and it's terrible to say, are able, you know, these words like permission, like it's just rubbish, you know, but what that looks like in a contemporary context, and also being mindful of the fact that, when you are pushed out of your land, like pushed out of your land, your country, your community, then you have to adapt to survive, and it may look a little bit different, and it may not be what you expect.
And my grandmother that's right, my grandmother chose to hide it, and that was a safe thing to do, and we sat there for a couple of generations, and now we're loud and proud. We're coming out and talking, and we're revitalising and reclaiming our stories. And, you know, we want help from people, not hindrance. We want help. We want assistance to stand up.
Absolutely.
Not to be kept down.
That's what the sort of the heart of reconciliation should be, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Didri Murray. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Being With, a Biennale of Sydney podcast. To learn more about the 23rd Biennale of Sydney rīvus, head to biennaleofsydney.art.